Jin Shan Zan Bama Gezer Dombo La Yam Zan Joga Mutu Bama Joni Jiza Zhang Gorda Wandu Mambo Go Jiji Jiza Dadu Shinji Labja Jaza Zang Guru Bama Zada Ho Jin Yajin Shan Bama Gezer Dombo La Yam Zan Joga Mutu Bama Joni Jiza Zhang Gorda Wandu Mambo Jiji Jiza Dadu Shinji Labja Jaza Guru Bama Zada Ho Jin Yajin Shan Bama Gezer Dombo La Yam Zan Joga Mutu Bama Joni Jiza Zhang Gorda Wandu Mambo Jiji Jiza Dadu Shinji Labja Jaza Guru Bama Zada Oma Hum Banzar Guru Bama Zada Oma Hum Banzar Guru Bama Oma Hum Banzar Guru Bama Zada Oma Hum Banzar Guru Bama Zada Oma Hum Banzar Guru Bama Zada Oma Hum Banzar Guru Sarda Oma Hum Banzar Guru Bama Zada Oma Hum Banzar Guru Bama Zada Uma Banzarangara Bama Sarda Uma Banzarangara Bama Sarda Uma Banzarangara Bama Sarda Ho Jila Da Jan Sora Da Be Da So Ganda Nibi Sabjo Nadan Warmbon Dabzo Jewa Gajin Beram Zata Sora Chumdan Dim Gombo Jahorang La Shamsa Lo Ganga Lo Tu Jumni Janja Nyada Namda Rasa Jinye Dunga Janja Zubshir Nyeje Dagara Lawamza Tanda Jimbi Zura Maru Manda Dungara Jizar Dozo Ganla Vachi Darje Yanla Tubje Yanda Dudara Jejo Nyamo Nyalo Leje Jojo Chamza Maru Maze Dungara Nyega Jinye Chamza Raja Dune Daja Sabjin Dazo Yunda Lizo Jeti Dao Chota Chata Jani Jantin Dalum Janhora Yang Lan Dada Umara Baza Narda 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 Nardo Marabaza Nardo Marabaza Nardo Marabaza Nardo Marabaza Nardo Marabaza Nardo Marabaza Marabaza Nardo Marabaza Nardo Marabaza Nardo Marabaza Nardo Marabaza Marabaza Nardo Sidana Jijin Jero Wozireki Dalo Dama Mambara Sani Kwadam Damju Jean-Lu Doba Ubi Nawa Geta Soro Nyaji Jimbo Zurdan Yimi Jan Zoni Molon Jimbo Ngajat Bakara Dangam Zandu Sharma Do Tumba Tiji Janla Shansar Lo Oya Tanita Terang Atsundana Tani Porik Tani Pandan Nambata Tani Nushok Mata Tani Jarigrim, Tani Mambos Limdik, Tani Tsangmala, Tomar, Tani Gomo Dela, Juyin.
Tonight we have in our audience Tibetans and Westerners and Chinese. Firstly, I'd like to say good evening to everybody.
Tani Natsu Terang Lakang Dinang La, Tani Bor Jarg. Tani Nashokuma, Tani Dindi Mambos Nyamdan Zomni, Tani Tsama, Tani Tambi Chu Nyamba, on the Nitana, Tani Narang Ranglayang, Tani Tamchipola, Tani Tambi Chu Shadji, Tani Korku, Tani Shongwala, Tani Pe Sim Gabo Shonsong.
I'm extremely pleased and extremely happy to have the chance to give a teaching on the Dharma here to the audience, which is comprised of Tibetans and Chinese and Westerners all gathering here together.
Tani ngarang so tambi chu toni shanana, tani yarik zeandata, porik zeandata, tani chi nupshok ko moze anda tani ko murk ko ni yewana tani chi kageyo mari.
When we're talking about the Dharma, then saying Chinese or Westerner or Tibetan, there is no need to make these distinctions between different ethnicities or peoples.
Tani chi murk garoze anda tam murk nakboze anda tam murk seroze anda tam tani ko tani to murjik ko thoni yewayang yo mari.
Similarly, there's no need to make distinctions or to discriminate between people who are white or black or yellow.
And
likewise, no need to make distinctions between people who are from the east and those who are from the west. And from the point of view of the Dharma, similarly, no point in making distinctions in terms of the countries that people come from, in terms of national borders.
So in terms
of Dharma, it's important that we don't make these distinctions and bring these distinctions into the Dharma, these distinctions between ethnicities and nationalities and this people and that people.
할레바가 자름 거 예와테 할레바가티 값스 서로다 되니 예와테 소 parlat니 된 탑수 대양 하정은 용장 된디 체위 강 된디즈리.
When Buddhism arose in India, they had a very clear differentiation between the four castes in Indian society, which was a source of great conflict.
옛날에 티가스더니 산지 좀 된데가 소나더니 당가서더니 먹을 때소 말에스 더니 먹을 자름금 통면 대양더니 소 말에 더니 슬라 더니 셔비오나 냥지오나 저바 냠린이오나 소종 약보요나 대소월에 마도 바테 잠바티서 소 말에서니 더니 소 말에스.
And the Buddha did not recognize these distinctions. He said that is not the basis on which to differentiate people, their caste or their class. In fact, what we should be judging people by or differentiating them by is their wisdom, their compassion, their realization, and their learning.
Then, 상기 나랑서 어떤이 똥바, 근데 송요티 되는 나랑 탐지 보여. 디 진지긴디 aside
from taking vows and proceeding in the Dharma, there was no other path to take. So in terms of the Dharma, and in particular the Mahayana tradition, it's important that we not just have a view of equality between all people, but also between people and animals, and this is the path in which we need to follow.
So in terms
So that we, Tibetans and Chinese and Westerners, are gathering here and are studying the Dharma together without these differentiations and distinctions is in complete harmony and accordance with the intention of the Buddha and the spirit of the Dharma.
ngarang cho shi bo yin zini da tin ri ma yin ba tin zambalang gam mo si na korang cho dojong shin dongken korang cho nyamsil nin dongken tin ri yin na o tin nga chu chund ngarang cho bo ba ga chu nga cho bo ba chi bo ma to ba zambalang nga chu go sha jam kum zini tin ri zejin yo mare zege yo mare tan zambalang gam sala yin na tin par tin go sha jam tham chu bola jin goya tin ri zri.
And the idea that the Dharma is the preserve of Tibetans and doesn't belong to anybody else, or that it belongs to Tibetans and shouldn't be shared with other people, is completely unfounded. Anybody who has the desire to learn the Dharma and to practice the Dharma is equally welcome and entitled to take part in the tradition.
Tani sanji chumdende nyangan len devi kapsa tani konga tani pe namba ni go ne pejut namba ni go ne tani koranga tani chuta maung bana tani kanji shine semchen thamchola gosha jab go mar go te koranga saru sung yores.
The Bezinanta.
Pejut.
Oh, Pejut. Oh, yeah. He gave 2 examples of the way that the Dharma would proceed in the future, the Buddha. The Buddha gave these examples.
Peshte kangre zena tani sanje ge songne ta pena tani gyarwo ta chongba chigla tani mushikpu ta shikpu zena choko mahachang ge shikpu tani zigla tani korang la tani po mangbo tani to yores korang chikpola purjit hachang mangbo yores tani ta tangbo te zena choko te korang la po hachang mangbo yores.
So one of the examples he gave was of an extremely wealthy person, a business person, a person with a lot of wealth who also had a lot of sons.
Tani shikpo de korang po mangbo di pa de tani ta ko shiwi kapsu tani po kashi korang ga tani ta sabla tani korang ga zhongla ndge yores kashi sholo la tani chong japsa ta tani mangchi wasu sholo la tani chong japya ta leka leya ta tani ge tongdak la tani song yores.
He said that when he passes away, that some of his sons will stay and look after the household, but most of them would have to go outside and work, do business, make money.
Tani ti kapsa tani tari shikpo gabo shikpo ti a koranga ramla yongken koranga zhongla yongken ga tani bu cheshu de sola tani ngarang ga tani jian de so tamchi po tani tartang ne kyoso lala tani jaga yensi. 옛날 디 나니 테니 다른 나랑 라티니 부하장 망보요. 그래서 참아 다스탄다나 요 말했다. 이나 코소 마옹바나 코소 참아 서 리뷰용 그래. 디 값스 코소 리뷰용에 그러나 테니 나랑 그 지연도 소탐죠 보. 데 코소 라라 야보 시니 고샤 잠니 코소라 짜고 딩겐테 테니 결혼sol라 요즈네. 테니 머식보디 테니 샤니 테니 코랑 시송어레스.
So before he died, he gave instructions to his son, who was closest to him, that in the future, all of his riches and inheritance should be divided up among the greater number of sons.
Well, that's an
that's the example or the story he told, but the meaning of it was.
다 동음마디 강레지나 드니 상지에 갔더니 다 고랑가 추송네 다 고랑 냥을 렌데죠 드니 달 드니 잡득이엔스 드니 옛날 드니 고랑은 잠텔라 디값스 다 고랑가 종나 용큰 것더니 디 로마티 솔라나 이 고랑가 드니 그 옹우 것더니 추 망보더니 다 추솔라 드니 송잘 송스
지sk 송사소
추 망보 고랑 솔라더니 송살 송스 다 교 koranga ta tomba koranga kumdan la yongken ko lomati sola ko sola tini chu mambo koranga tini ta lo mambo la chosola chu mambo song yores.
So the Buddha said this as he was preparing to pass into nirvana. He said to his closest disciples around him, I've given you a great number of teachings. I've taught you a lot of Dharma.
Yena tini ta mahajang mambo's tarong teni sanji chude teni nyan koso nyan teni the gorkup teni the tobio maris.
But still, at that time, there were a lot of people who hadn't had the opportunity to hear the Dharma being preached.
이나 되니 망보 대소 탐주포 마음바나 칼레 코소 용네 되니 코랑소 용네 되니 코랑소라양 되니 춘더 코랑소 냔게 되니 그 고급도 코소라 용거레스 마음바나.
But he said in the future there will be people who come to hear the Dharma, and they should have the opportunity in the future to hear it as well.
되니 코소 된지도 마음바나 코소라 고급 요비 김승강레제나 되니 산지가 손에 되니 못대서 탐주포 되니 코랑 랑거 되니 다 이연 하장 랑볼로 하장 망볼라 되니 코소라 나마께와 나마나라 코소라 추망보 시안니 되니 코소라야 되니 소소고 셈거나라 되니 사운 박착 되니 데 코소라 지거려 옛날 네르급스 다른 코소 용 되니 추년제 고그 마용으로다 마음바나 산지가 콩고 되니 소소고 셈거나라 되니 사운 답 된디시오피 점선지 마음바나 코소 니버트 용네 춘데 되니 냥거레스.
So the important thing was to be sowing the seed in the consciousnesses of these people, so that perhaps at this point in time they might not be able to hear the Dharma or learn it, but in the future they certainly would.
다 되니 산지가 되니 콩 되니 다 냥을 낸데로 그래서 옛날 다 코랑 콩거 추대 되니 디 교랑 속어 다 락란 적거 연지 되니 마음비 못대소때 고소 용디 되니 콩거 추대 인담마다 코랑 속어 라바나라 약보스 되니 스트라고 손에 되니 손바레스.
And then the Buddha said, who he was preparing to pass into nirvana, was nearing this point, and he said, so now the job is in your hands to pass the Dharma on to the future generations of people who come to, who aspire to hear it.
That tinti terang atsola tini bena murukaroyen nanda, naboyen nanda, seroyen nanda, tani chitini yayen nanda, boyen nanda, tani nushokomayen nanda, korang siziyone ngala chulgozine korang tini lakbazinkin tinizgona, tingatso korang lakbi nala jagogore, tingatso lengan res.
So similarly today, when there are all kinds of people, Tibetan people, Chinese people, Western people who want to hear the Dharma, indeed the responsibility of today is to pass these teachings into the hands of the people who want to hear it.
Teni te pechigre, teni pe nipati kangrezena, teni sanjega sone, perna, ta nyamat me, dawa me, teni karma yang me pi nerkam sammu mannak, o teni zikanala, teni mamambo zikateni ta koso, teni lam hajanga nyenka chimbo, teni zika par teni rogona, teni matsama lala, drumme me, lok, tati kapsi yo mata, drumme me, chichu me nazi. Mena mamambo titini ta pandro gui kapsa ti kapsa karte muchik lagna tani marmen tani yo nazi.
The other example that he spoke of was a future day or at some point in time where there's no moon and there's no stars and there's no sun, there is no illumination, the world is cast into darkness, and people have to walk along a path, a road in great danger, with no torch or no lantern to guide their way, that if just one person standing there held a lantern in their hand,
tani pena muschik lagla ti mahachang mambuti nana muschik la korang la tani lagbag nangla marme yona tani korang marme te la tani korang lamkha yakboz lagne tani korang tani lamchang nyengkha chan tani paro la tani thon sonazi tati muti tani karishe gorezi ti domete te kone tini sala yuja goreta karishe gorezi.
So if that person who was holding the lantern managed to traverse that dangerous road and reach the end of it, what should they do? Should they put it down? What should they do with the lantern then?
Tati kapsa ngarang su samlo tangna gandishe gosare. Garti muti korang gata ngarang lagbaga nani Rummin de la tene ngarang lam kayak pos laksong tan riksong samne te yuja goreta yana tini muti ti rumme ti shersone mo jambate sola trak gores.
So, what do we think that person really should do? That having safely reached the end of this dangerous road from themselves, that they should, having reached the end of it themselves feeling happy, just put it down or cast it away, or should they pass it on to others?
Gartiti kausatini muti korang katini te lapa nala yo chi domete teni korang paror to son service teni sala igine teni me pa shejana teni mutsama samlo tana ta teni digbore ni digjagres ni teni zekires.
Of course, if the person who reached the end of the road were just to throw it on the ground and do no more, then of course everybody would say that person's terrible and bad and evil.
Tani ta onati kandi che gore zena tani ngaso teram di nala yong ken gam chama zena kandi samjere zena tani ngaso chama thumung de chigir go ne ngaso chama oti mati tani marmite jambala tag gore ma to tani thangla ine mebashina tin de kamare ze ngaso chama te sam gres.
I think everybody here tonight would definitely be of the opinion that the thing to do would be to pass the lantern on to somebody else, and certainly not to fling it on the ground and destroy it.
This thing pe japa mare te saje pe japa pe ni po te saje rang song bare ndo na la yore.
Both of those examples are not my own personal examples. They're both examples or metaphors that the Buddha spoke of himself there in the sutras.
Ta tendi endi tene ta te pere teni don te kare zena don upo te korang te pe te kari sha ke zena teni nga cho sangji ge song la lo jong che teni sangji ge song la nyamlin che ne ta nga cho Gandhi she gozare, teni Gandhi shina teni ta demo tang kebo yong sare, Gandhi shina nga cho la dengmur yong sare, samjit teni nga cho ha goyo res. Teni ha goyo na, ta nga rang chipo ha goya te, jamba chigla mafshen ni, teni nga rang teni ta chig sak chigla mafshen ni, teni shini nduna, teni ta nga cho pendat mos chigbo ti korang ka marme la teni, korang chi paro la son sarvi jis, teni marme thang la ikba tang, teni chigba res.
So it's really the same. What this example is really saying is that it's like us. If we study the Dharma, we study how to be happy, how to alleviate our suffering, benefit from the Dharma, but then enjoying the benefits that it brings us, don't pass that teaching or knowledge onto other people, then this is exactly the same as casting the lantern onto the ground and not concerning oneself about passing it on to others.
Tendri indi ta nga cho ngarang cho tini lama kwadran la tini nga cho ta sangji chu gandhi drib go sare gandhi shina tharwa thop sare gandhi shina tini khorwa na la ro sare samjit tini nga cho ha goyo res goyo na tini nga cho tini goyo pa te ta janla jeng go re te nga cho wungen res.
So our responsibility is with the great kindness of our teacher, knowing how to practice the Dharma, how to achieve liberation, how to transcend samsara. With this understanding, it's our responsibility to pass that on to others.
Tendi yendi teni nga cho yewa mambo shene pena teni chi teni ta nga cho chundo chigla jin chigla mojin tendi nga cho tendi yewa mambo shena
So if we, bearing this in mind, if we decide to discriminate against who we are going to teach the Dharma to or who we're going to share it with and who we're not, discriminating between this person and that person, then this behavior or this stance is in direct contradiction with the commandment of the Buddha.
Tene sangji chu ngarang so so tene chenpo shinanda chongchong shinanda ngarang so shiwa te nga so simsim tamche pola jinya te tene nga so rang tene lengen res.
So it's our duty, regardless of whether we only know a little Dharma or we know a lot, to pass that on to others.
Tene kyorang so tene so tene toptang de kang resena tene ta jayen nanda poyen nanda tene no shok mayen nanda teni muru garoye na nakboye nanda musi nanda teni kyorang so toptang de kang resena tang ngala teni sanji ge chute ngala go zeni kyorang so teni yong ni sanji ge chute lensa yong je 티 교수 참말라 티 톱탕도 요리.
So having just spoken about duty, what is the right of everybody here? What is your right? Well, your right is, regardless of whether you're Tibetan or Chinese or Western or whatever your background is, whether you're a white person or a black person, etc., your right is to request the teaching of the Dharma, to say, this is what I need, to request this teaching. That is everybody's right.
Teni ti 톱탕도 교수라 스그 잡아래잖아. 나초 teni 교수라 톱탕도 잡아 말에 상지 좀 든데 랑거 참말라 톱탕도 짜요리.
And who was the grantor of this right, or who was the giver of this right? It was the Buddha and no one else.
Teni 인디 가서 마웅바나 베날 하강 든지가 나라 teni 추샤나 teni 가서 모바이난자 야연난자 너쇼코마연난자 teni 탐시 용네 teni 창마가 대추 까르와 베나가서 고샤즈 잡아연나다 창마라 까르와티 요레테 까르와티 렌나 티 톱탕 수술라 요레테 상지 좀 든데 공바담 텀바리.
So in the future, when everybody gathers in halls, Dharma centers like this, it's the right and prerogative of everybody, regardless of their background, to and without distinction, to request teaching of the Dharma.
Teni ngaso shusoko tolashenna benamer karoyenna nohoyennaja teni chi sharshoko noshoko teni ewa mangbo yorisi yinda bena ngaso hakang dendri zgnala yongni changma ndikchavini kavna changman ramnimri titolayo kagayo mare.
So in everyday society, of course, there are so many distinctions and differentiations between all kinds of different people. But when we gather in a Dharma space like this, in an assembly hall or a shrine, then none of those differences or distinctions should make any difference whatsoever. And this is the equality that the Buddha speaks of.
Teni ramnim nipa de kanglezena namba sanji pa nangla teni gewa mergewa teni lejimde zene penanga so jarkub ko teni chu chhamtawa teni go teni to tan dindi shina geware dindi shina digbare on dindi shina yagbo yongore dindi shina digbo yongore zene teni koranga teni sadun tawa teni zo teni talla phabyores gewa j mergewa j tawa teni zo zawa teni lejimde teni yores.
What we just spoke about, the first kind of equality, the equality of everybody gathering in a Dharma space together, was the first kind of equality. The second kind of equality is the equality that exists in society in terms of laws that lay out what kind of behavior is virtuous, what kind of behavior is not virtuous, what kind of behavior will bring good results, bad results.
Then teni soso rang teni lejimde thola situng yakboshi teni gewa jib teni yakboshi na perna nangba la lojong shenken na teni korang dewa chan lan ore higher land ore ten rawaz ke yishi chulgla teni lojong shenken zina teni korang higher land ore muslim ke teni te chula lojong shenken zina korang higher land ore chulu sidang signa korang gewa jimken teni jam tamsi bola pamba dumkun kumuzgna sina teni te korang ta higher land ona da dewa chan land ona da tndro re ma to pate ngaso chulu khashis dewa chan land ore khashin ro marezi teni ewa yo maris.
So in terms of the principle of cause and effect, this applies to everybody equally, regardless of their religious view and their idea of where they're going to pass into after they die, whether that be heaven or pure land or.
Tani karti li jimde tela tani stung yakpo mashini tani digba mergiwa tani shinana tani nambala lojong shenken zigina tani ta higher land ro thab ko mare dewa jala che thab ko mare ten rawaz ko chulu jamba ina tani thab ko mare te saman ramnimri.
So regardless of what one's religious faith is, if they don't adhere to the law of cause and effect as it pertains to their religious tradition, whether it be a Buddhist and their idea of what results their virtuous behavior will bring, or a Christian who adheres to their particular idea of good behavior and the results that that will bring, then the result is ultimately the same.
대연 사티 때니 남바 상지바 다와인나는 베나 당아서 남바라 때니 예치신근 대소 상마 때니 더다 내가 잔란 로레 마토바 잠바 탐신로 말이지 때니 제가 말이지.
From the Buddhist point of view, saying that, we Buddhists are going to go to, Amitabha's Pure Land and everybody else is not. This is not a proper view. So when we talk about equality in terms of the law of cause and effect, then this is the second kind of equality we're talking about. And the third kind of equality that we can talk about, that the Buddha spoke about, was that everybody, regardless of their own religious tradition, has their own particular set of values. So it's important that even if you're a Buddhist and you have a Buddhist faith and the desire to practice as a Buddhist, at the same time, it's very important to maintain respect of other people and their own religious faiths and traditions. If, for example, there's a person who's not interested in believing in Buddhism or who's not interested in studying Buddhism, but we force it upon them that they do so, well, this kind of behavior is in contradiction with the Bodhisattva vow. And similarly, by criticizing people of other religious faiths, saying, you're bad or you're inferior, insulting or disparaging people of other religious faiths, well, this is in contravention of the sixth tantric vow. Similarly, we Buddhists are all good and all those non-Buddhists are bad. This kind of way of viewing things is also not permissible. So this is the third kind of equality. So, in keeping with these three kinds of equality, then people, whether they be Tibetan or Chinese or Westerner, regardless of their background, they need to proceed in accordance and in harmony with these three equalities.
티초 인다 만다 타바 요고 인증 문증 가솔라 타바시고 딘리앙 제그마리 데니 카티초 타바 신근스 있나 데니 가서 디나라 예와 망보시네 데니 타직 데니 지카로 나보 딘리아 딘리앙 시그마리 티 코랑 타바시나 시나 시나초 디 마시나 지라양 데니 더 인다 만다 시고즈니 딘리 제그마리 데니 티 가서 짜든지.
So our, the basic point is, or the basic principle, is really that it's not all right for us as Buddhists to inflict or impose our views on other people who are not interested in taking them on. Similarly, among those of us who do have Buddhist faith, to engage in all kinds of barrier making and discrimination and distinctions among Buddhists themselves is similarly not okay.
대인비 김선지 되는가서 보크추 따와였나 되는가서 잠발랑가 너블라였나자 잠발랑가 샬라였나자 되니 보마인비 사차잠바 강당 강란조나 되는가서 사네 같더니 뭐 거랑서 되니 다빠데라 되니 메바 거랑서라 진족 제거래서 가서 시 고거래 되는가서 짜던데.
So it's a basic duty of Buddhists to be respectful of the religious tradition and beliefs of other people around us in the societies in which we live.
Tani karte koranso tini ramu gone tini ta tabashin kentindi yonana tini ngaso tinala chik tinala yong chok chik tinala yong mechok tindi yewa kage meba chamala ngaso gapsi jogore te ngaso tsadun chigri.
Again, it's our basic duty to welcome all people who are interested or who aspire to learn the Dharma. It's not okay to be partial in terms of who we welcome and who we don't. Everybody needs to be welcomed similarly.
Teni tinji insarti teni terang tawala ina nga sundi nala teni yayin na re teni boyin na re teni nabshokoma ina tsamayona nga so garsi yin zibi gimsen tenri ziris.
So this is the reason that tonight we welcome everyone, regardless of whether they're Chinese, Tibetan, or Westerner. These principles of equality are the basic foundation of that.
Teni ramnyam chenpo sim zeyate teni nga so namba nane teni nangdun hajanga kar cheshu zire teni te tsama hako goris.
Everybody needs to know that these three great equalities are a very important part of Buddhism.
Ta teni nga so terang ga teni shuchat teni taga ta gon zinne teni shakiyins.
And from here we will begin with tonight's teaching.
Teni tomar sosogo teni samba shangshim chokta simkit shangshim chokta simkit gores.
First of all, may everybody please generate in their hearts bodhicitta.
Teni shangshim chokta simkit ziyati kangriz glata zegre zena dondag ni chang gore chakin ni yo gores.
In order to do this, in order to generate bodhicitta, there are two conditions.
Teni chakin ni de kangre zena tambo te ngazo terang de la chujia yong vitini chuji vitini yong chuji vitini muyer te kangre zena teni ngazo semchin tamche la nge panba chegeyen semchin tamche la teni pan toya ga lekaz teni nge legeyen semchin tamche la dingmur me ya teni lekaz teni nge legeyen samne dondak tambote chakin tambote teo gore mangjing omate teres.
So the basic foundation of the first condition is that we proceed with the aspiration, the motivation of being here tonight, that we are able to, or we aspire to benefit all beings, that all beings obtain happiness and that all beings find relief from suffering.
Tani simshin tamchel latini to pan dribzena tanga cho tartanga cho lati tindi niba chimbo yo mare nga cho chila yo mare.
In terms of benefiting all beings, well, perhaps at the moment our capacity to do so is not particularly great.
Tani nga cho latindi niba mena ta nga cho garipche go rezena.
And if we don't have this capacity, well, then what do we need to do? What should we do?
Tani nga cho tambo ta ngarang sangina Teni ngarang ka sinchim mambola pantosare teindi nga sangji ta ngarang ka sangji drip ka yin samje ko samba teo gores.
We need to fervently make the aspiration that we achieve Buddhahood, and we can achieve Buddhahood in order to benefit all beings.
Teni shanship sim zia de nga zo kha teni shadna hajang ka lesna bores.
Of course, it's very easy to just say bodhicitta.
Tsuk ni ma to yo mare taringe kona shapateri tsuk ni ma to yo mare hajang lesna bores.
It's just a one word. It's very easy to pronounce, a few syllables.
Yena nga so uni tane khayo lagayo ko tone nyamlin shi guna ti hajang ka lesna bo mare.
But in actual fact, to put it into practice, to actually practice bodhicitta is something quite entirely less easy.
Te lesna bo mare ta yena nga so karti lochik semchik ko tone tene te shawati drimna tene tsawani mandrya tindi yang mare.
Even though it is not easy, even though it is difficult, if we devote ourselves to this single-mindedly, then it is not something that is beyond us either.
Tene nga so jangmu shadna se yana nguni shadna nga so mushik ko mase ko nangla tene shanship ko sem ti gomba gomya tele karchewa ko shawa jan chichi yo mare.
To really to speak to the heart of the matter, apart from meditation on bodhicitta and practicing bodhicitta, there is nothing more important in our lifetimes.
Tene suso ko samlo tana nga so masin di nangla tene nguni tane dondang damba tang tene hajang ka rentang yo ba da gang re samne samlo tana ta nga chu ndri sinin zumu tsuksa tindi rakgona hajang khak bores rak mares.
In fact, if we try to identify something in our lifetimes that's more important than working on cultivating bodhicitta, it's extremely difficult to identify anything.
Tene nga so tirip jogypa, tirip judunba, tene to tirip jirgba, tene ga nangla nga so mamangpo zka chapart nshok mo so shisa, mamangpo zka samlo tangna, tene nga so demo tang kepo ziate. Teni ta ngubo nani teni yongre samne shiro ko ngubo longsho ko nani yongre ta pamjur yarje tangore samne teni mse muyirte tere samne mamboz ko teni kha shayang shari yige tebyang mambo triore te chama ga teni basu yang share.
In the West, from the 17th to the 19th centuries in particular, there was a great feeling, a very popular idea and sentiment that the way for us to achieve happiness was through material ends. And indeed, many books have been written about this. So much has been spoken about it. The idea that happiness is to be obtained through the material world.
Tani tika sangaso tenti sambatela tini kayo mareze maybe Jameson chireze na tika sangaso zambolong ka shar nab chama horworeze tenga so jirzi mambo yo mareze maybe kapsa tini ngaso tenti yona ta ngaso ke boyon sare samne tenti samre jirzi longsho tela ngaso tini chaji mado pamjola chaji yo mare chaji meiti tini ngaso tenti to pamjol yona ta ngaso demo ke boyon sare samne tenti manam gi tini samgare te kayo mare te samlo yonse mahmamba samlo yarjinro matepi samlo tindizres.
Well, of course, this kind of idea was completely understandable in a situation where these kinds of ideas and this kind of vision is unrealized, that people don't have familiarity with what that state would actually be like. Then this kind of idea that happiness could or should be obtained through these means is reasonable or understandable.
Tadini ngato terang tirim nishi tsachi pa nangla yoni ta shir tana tani bamjur dosoy na tendi tini hachang karchim botang rantang damba tendi wa mayin bati shimkhang ko moni ores moni ti shindus
Shinkin suri.
Moni shimkhang ramba jin to shakre.
Oh yeah. Now, in the 21st century, turning back and looking back on history as it has unfolded, there are two kinds of people, or two people who know that this kind of endeavor, the energy and endeavor that was put into economic development and achieving happiness through the material world, in fact, is not that important, or is in fact not to be valued in such a way.
Tani shinkan ke mo ni to kan re na chite sa je sha ja da ba re se khong ko lo tong cha ni da ngap ja ko ne te shin do.
Oh, okay. So one of the one of the people who knew this was in fact the Buddha, who knew it over 2,000 years ago.
Tani mo ni pa te kan re na mo ni pa te mo chik ma re se mo mang bu ze re ta na nge mo chik ze ni rig chik yin pi yin ni chik ze re ma to ba ngoni ta ni sha na mo chik ma re mo mang bu ze re ta na nge te la mo chik ze re mo chik te kan re na tani nga chon no shok ko tani yar gi sung ze bi jar ko na la yong khang ko mo ha chang ko shik bo kor chik re.
And then the second the second person who also knew or realized the futility of this kind of endeavor was in fact not actually one individual, but many, many people. For the sake of convenience, Khenpo speaks about it in terms of one person, but is in actual fact those people in the West who are extremely well off, who are extremely fortunate, who are extremely rich.
Tani tata nga chu nabshok chi bo mai na sharshok na ne yang tani mambo ze remji rembe tani te ha ko yong go yores.
And likewise, it's not just now people from the West who have gained this realization, but increasingly people all over the place, people in the East too. Gradually, more people are coming to a similar realization.
Ta tenji indi tani ta mo ni po ti tani khorang cho tani ta ta shindu te mayen ba nga so mambo ze ko tarung yang ha ko yo mare.
And except for these two people, or the Buddha and all of those others, there are still lots of people who haven't come to this realization. Lots of people who really don't know the futility of this kind of lifestyle.
Tarong yang nga chola jimang boyo na khangba chim boyo na tani to langkhor ha jang tani gong chim boyo na te ha jang ga tani ta ma se ren thang dang dang ba ma se tong dang dang ba re samni ti jabla tarong yang mambo.
In fact, there are lots of people who still very much strive towards obtaining lots of wealth, a car, a great big house.
But
those people who have already arrived there, those people already have these things, a big fancy car and a fancy house as well. Many of them are able to, having arrived, turn and look back with some kind of perspective.
Zole sarje tarni teni lo nibjata ngapche tendis ka nala chama kable mambo jamne ta pamjoria je tangna teni chama demo che boyongare samne teni leka mambo jap kird mambo japi jis ta pamjoria je son sawe kapse teni yang so tan dinala yang dekit mandu zenita shiryon kapse teni ta wona dekit kanan du zena ngaso mambo ka hago mandu.
So even though now looking back 250 years after the Industrial Revolution and all of the effort and struggle and work and toil that people have invested over the years subsequent, looking back on it to see whether it has generated happiness, whether happiness has occurred as a result of this.
Korangso yarje song chankan teso wono tinala nyambo munduk samne tap shokchini mariong gandu yena ngaso tarong tela mahle patsan tarong yarteni jigne teni jikioreta jigna yang thar teni ta yarje song charwi mteda ka chorwa teda ka nyamnyong tawre tonji tone ngaso nguni tane masega nyambo zindi ngubo nane ni guna 니트고 말이 럭트고 말이
So, with the exception of those people who have, been able to obtain a particular standard of affluence and are able to look back with this perspective and appreciate the lack of value in this kind of existence, there are really still so many people who are striving and struggling and really orienting themselves to this kind of these objectives.
Tani kaja tinrade ngaso lo nivja gong lo samja gong la shanna tani chama yichi maris.
If we were to have said this, that there is in fact little value in this kind of vision, in these kind of values, if we were to have said this 200 or 300 years ago, then nobody would have believed it.
Tani terang ngaso kaja tinri shanna mamambus ko te re samne te koranso te semla te re samne kelen rores.
But today, when we say this, there are in fact many people who realize the truth of this kind of insight. Still, really, in terms whether there are a lot of people who accept this, perhaps there still aren't a lot of people who accept it, but gradually there will be more and more people who come to view this as an accurate assessment or evaluation of the state of things. Yeah, and the point that we come to understanding this is when we've obtained this big car and when we've obtained this fancy house, then we're at a point where we are able to appreciate this insight. However, nevertheless, this life of ours is extremely short. When given the shortness of our lives, we don't, in fact, have so much time if we're going to be doing a bit of this over here, doing a bit of that over there, pursuing this path for a while, then changing to that path, engaging or indulging in all kinds of choices. We actually don't have that much time to be doing this. So it's very important that we choose one path and that we proceed in that path. And what is that one path that we should follow? What is that one path that will bring us happiness, bring happiness to ourselves, and bring happiness to others? That path is the generation, the meditation on bodhicitta. And that's the reason why today we are going to talk about bodhicitta. So given that generating bodhicitta, given that bodhicitta is in fact so important, what we're going to talk about tonight is how to practice meditation on bodhicitta. In terms of talking about the method of meditation, it's not something that I've cooked up in my own mind and fabricated myself. Perhaps you might think that if I tell you about, or if I teach you about this method of meditation tonight without basing it on a scripture or a written teaching, you might think that it is in fact something that I have made up myself, but this is not the case.
Tani kangsha karizina nge ngaranga lamadang, tani lamaga lamadang, o tani shini nga tso lo tongcha nita ngabja nangla, tani kharshok tani gyartong chamba mambo ziko koso nyamyung te.
So what I am teaching you tonight is the teaching and experience of my teacher and my teacher's teacher and my teacher's teacher's teacher, and in fact a lineage of teachings that goes back 2,500 years to the Buddha. When we talk of bodhicitta, it's such a mighty and glorious thing. Where we are presently, there seems and in fact is a great distance between this really wonderful and mighty qualities and our present state. However, notwithstanding this, if we think, oh, well, if it's that difficult, then if it's that difficult to obtain, I'm never going to get there. It's so far away from me. Well, I'm not going to practice it. In fact, this is something that we absolutely must not think.
Yang hajang ta lelo ze machina ta gangster teni ta rang rang la ja zibi ze rang rang lam thong shong shi ni teni ta teni she sona ta nga so chuang drib ko mare jitin teni pe na chong zi jab go na ten drib ko mare kan drib ko mare.
If we think that it is so far away from us, it's something we're never going to be able to obtain or we're never going to be able to cultivate, this is in fact a very lazy attitude, and not just a lazy attitude, but also an attitude of quite some self-inferiority. And it's really manifesting almost an inferiority complex that. And if we really think like this, then not only are we not going to be able to achieve the generation of bodhicitta, we really won't be able to do anything in life. So what we do need to think is that even though it is difficult, it is a difficult goal, it is a difficult objective to commit ourselves to, we need to really generate confidence in the knowledge that there have been hundreds and thousands of people who have gone before us who have managed to attain this and who have managed to generate bodhicitta.
Tani ta shangship ke semze ade gangze gre zina nga so gongde shaba nangjin re ta nge nima derang ne se tani nge semchen tamchil la tani phamba drib ge yin se semchen tamchil kang re zina ta nga so more tani tandro re aya tanji tang tani pe na nga so chuluk na le na ta nga so nangba yin na ja tani yishi chuluk nyamling shin kan yin na ja tani di muslim ke chuluk nyam sling kan shin na yin na ja de mayen ba nga so do mi chulung jamra mangbo yore de nyamling shin kan yin nan ja de mayen ba pe na teni ti ngusu ta lamit teni shem kan yin nan ja mo chama la teni nge phamba drup ko yin samni to tani sam go res.
And what we do need to think, how we do need to cast our aspiration is that from this day onward, I am going to benefit all beings being people, being animals, being all all sentient beings, regardless of their religious belief or their caste or their background or creed, etc., all living beings, similarly and likewise, I am going to be of benefit to.
Ta tenri ge samlo te nga cho tangrib ke mozla samlo pe jana halipa khakbore se yimbi jimsang kare re na ngarang cho te ni ta lobja chungrim lobja jangrim tani lobja chembore ta cho chama ga na la nga cho loso tani nyamsun yong de ya loso te mangchewa ti na la gari ja ge ore se na ngarang rang de ni gurmu mambo rathab ngarang rang yak bo yong ya tani ngarang rang de mo che bo yong ya tinti tak tak la nga cho lo jong che ge ore tinti yendi tinti ge ka sa nga cho loso te tinti yen charti tani nge ngarang par jerne nge simchen la phamba drop ken tinti ge samlo te nga cho lang khur gona te kak bo yore.
Why is, in fact, the idea that we are going to benefit all beings quite difficult, in fact, extremely difficult for people in this modern age to really generate and commit themselves to? The reason is that from primary school through to high school and beyond, we're really inculcated with the idea that our lives should be about benefiting ourselves, whether it be succeeding in our careers or getting lots of money. And then the idea that we should put this all aside, put our self-interests and our own goals aside and work for the sake of others is in fact something with quite some degree of difficulty.
Tani nga so tangrib ke mozla ya nge tani chuluk yewa me pa tani chokchak ko tani chi te simshin ko ramba tanro ta mo yewa me pa tani chi tani jarkab ko tani jansam ko yewa me pa tani ji ko ni nge simshin thamchu pola nge phamba drub go tani sam go re zena tani mambu z ko tani simshin thamchu pola nge phamba drub go jimsang kari nge te sola tani phamba tani drub go jimsang kang re zeni te jimsang te la samlo tang je ma to tani nge ngone tani go re samne tani samkan ta nyung re.
Really, the number of people who were able to cast the aspiration and really be able to believe that I want to or can benefit all beings regardless of their backgrounds and their distinctions, and without differentiating between humans and animals, and then among animals, between animals themselves. People who are able to do this are in fact very, very rare, very, very few.
Tani tinji goni jimsan tani ta jimsan kare zini ta yondi tani nga so karte sangji shakya ta pa lopso tani ze mena nga so me mambo ze jimsan kan ha ko yo mares.
The reason with so many people really not knowing the reason why they should in fact orient themselves towards benefiting all beings, without the Buddha's teaching, in fact, it's very difficult for people to understand why.
Tani nga so jimsan moko ai nga so ti jimsan te rak nyek mandu zi te manye pi jimsan kan re zena te nga so mukum thongje tani nga so na wa tu je nga so sem gi shi ji de shibsha de nga so nyung ma to tani shigyo ma nga so mukti tani thong ma tong thong mandu nga so na wa ti tani ta nyung ma to ba tani ta go yo ma re tani nga so sem de ge yang ti jisting ge tani te lo ji nyung ma to tani shigyo ma re ti nyung ti nang la tani nga so jimsan kan re zena nga so jimsan nyek yo ma re manye pi jimsan de nga so shisha mambo zo me shiwi jimsan ji re.
So the reason that we're not able, or many people are not able to understand why they should benefit all beings, is that everyone, or really everyone, is extremely constrained by what they are able to know. They're constrained by the limits of what their eyes can tell them and their ears can tell them and what their brains are able to concern. In fact, what they can understand are just patches here and there on a greater map. They're unable to, of their own selves, obtain an understanding of the reason for why they should be benefiting all beings.
Tene nga so shangship ko sem zeyade gang rezena di shangship ko sem te la tenne nga ran so samlo la jangjor tango res.
Jangjor.
Jefang.
Oh yeah. Sula tene jefang tango.
Samlo jangjor tango.
Oh yeah. So what we really need to do is liberate our own minds, our own thoughts on this matter.
Tani Gandhi Chandro Tango Resina, Tanga Yanchula Natsu Sama, the Nara Rangaton, Tadala Samno Tane, the Nat Demo Gandio, Natibo Gandio, then this Samlo Tangares, Tanga Yanchula.
Demos?
Demo, Kibo,
Yeah.
Nara Rang Demo, Nara Rang Kibo, then the Yongagatonla, then Natsu Samlo Tangares.
Samgayuri.
Then Natsu Tanga Yanchu, then the Chang Samgayores.
Oh, okay. Previously, I thought solely about my own happiness and about my own success. That is what I did in the past.
Tani ta panchoni ngaso tani te par jangni ta panchoni ngaso ta rangyang demo kyopo yung go rete ya jamba tamche pon tani demo kyopo yung go re samne tani ngaso mo yinanja chokchaka yinanja tani tamche pola demo kyopo yung ya dondala tani samlo tango re tela ngaso nangba ga chani shana tela samlo jangdor zegres.
But from here on in, even though, yes, I do require my own measure of well-being and happiness, I'm nevertheless going to work for the benefit of all beings, for their happiness and for their well-being. Well, this is what we mean by Buddhist liberation, or liberation in Buddhism.
다 딘디가 드니 삼로테 가솔라 람상 드니 요르고나 하장 각보리 요 말이다 옛나양 드니 가서 심캄 그토라 드니 용저스타야가 드니 탑시 때라 땐나 드니 그 삼로테 가서 갈래 드니 테 삼로테 가서 셈라 드니 다 끼용 그래서 상집고 셈디 끼용 그래서
It's quite difficult for us all of one sudden to be able to generate this kind of state of mind or aspiration. So what we need to do is to train our minds to develop means, strategies for being able to gradually cultivate this aspiration and quality.
다 딘디가 탑시대 가서 드니 뭐 그추고 나라였나 드니 할레바 망보는 도즈티 탑시대 할레바가 망보 갸침보 드니 탑데보 드니 장장 다 딘디 뭐 그추고 나라였나 드니 가서 지 냥마였나 다 게르였나 사샤였나 드니 과지였나 강당강였나 디 참마가 디 추고 나라 디 탑시대 하장 망보 요레스
strategies or methods to train ourselves in being able to generate this kind of aspiration. There are so many in the Tibetan religious tradition. All kinds of convenient and easily practiced methods, vast methods, clever methods, regardless of, within all of the different schools and lineages of Tibetan Buddhism, teachings on this are something the Tibetan religion is very rich in. And today, what I'm going to introduce to you is, of all of these different means and methods that exist, just one of them.
하정 것들이 딱 대슈 되래지 정말 고나 약보 고토야 띵욕자 띵디 망보 메바 삼로 망보 띵이 땅 멀고야 띵디 딱 대슈 되래지.
And the method I'm going to teach you tonight is the most convenient, the most easily understood, the most easily practiced, a method that doesn't have a great deal of elaborateness, a very wonderful, convenient method that is easy to put into practice.
Teni te tab deshu te reta yinayang teni karte nga chu te yakboz teni nyamlin shina te nga chu gella shangchib ku sim ngebar te teni ke thab gres.
So even though it's an extremely convenient kind of practice, if we're really able to apply ourselves to it properly, then it is an absolute guarantee that we will be able to generate bodhicitta within our mind streams.
Tani ta tabshiti kangrezena nga chu shangchib ku sim gum gona teni korang ka mange korang ka tsawa di kangrezena tani tsamme pa je zeke di toni yarandro gores tsamme je.
So the basis of this method that we need to proceed is the four immeasurables.
Tani tsamme je zeke de kangrezena tani tomar nyarji res nyarji de kangrezela zegrezena tani ngaso tani semkhong ripi htang nezena ngaso loschik semchik gone tani ta semchin tamchipu dungmar sawani me patini zere sona samne tani khoranga khaji nimi katini samna tela nyarji se gres.
So, in terms of the four immeasurables, the first is compassion. And what is compassion? It's the really strong and heartfelt aspiration that all living beings be free from suffering.
Teni ti nyarji re, teni chad me pa se ati kang re jena, teni nga cho ti nyarji ti pe na nge apa ti teni dungur me pa re sona, nge ama ti re sona, nge nduruk ti re sona, teni nge boda bomo ti re sona, nge chokbu ti teni sam teni changma ma re jen, nge simchin tamchit, teni chokchak yin nan ja, teni tamchit teni re sona, teni dungur me pa teni re sona sam na, teni ta chad me re, ti chad me se goya jimsin ti simchin lam tayo ma re, simchin chad me pa re, simchin tamchit la teni samlo ti par gyachin bo teni shi na, teni te la chad me pa se gare, nyarji tang chad me zini, teni ni te jao ma re se, nga zo nyarji yang yin la, chad me pa yang yin ba, teni zi la samlo tang go re.
And when we talk of immeasurable, what we're talking about is the fact that this aspiration needs to be cast by ourselves to all sentient beings. So our wish is not just that our own fathers or our own spouses or children or loved ones obtain this liberation from suffering and great happiness. No, it's the desire, it's the aspiration that all living beings obtain this great result. So when we talk of the immeasurable nature of the four immeasurables and compassion, there's absolutely no contradiction between them. They go completely together.
Teni nga zo pena chamme pa maim ba de kan dizela se gre na, ta pena nga zo bon ja bo tin dizela samlo ta na ne, ta nge apha teni ta demo ke bore sona sam. So
what would be the opposite of immeasurable? I suppose measurable. That would be the idea or the hope, the wish that my own father obtains great happiness and comfort and well-being, or my own mother obtains this. This would be a partial kind of practice or aspiration.
Teni gyanja o yin na teni ta apa ta ama yang sam gre ta tele kyang teni ngi pud yang pozre sona ngi pomo de teni te dungur me pa re sona sam ni teni sam gre ta te sam me pa je mare te chatam je pa teni re je nyar ji te.
So that last aspiration that one's own mother and father be well and be happy, Khenpo was talking about this being a Tibetan version of a compromised version of a compromised aspiration. Perhaps a Chinese person who was being non-immeasurable in their aspiration would be wishing for the well-being and happiness of their own sons or daughters.
Teni nga chon nushong ja yen nge hajang sarbo hako me da nge 아파다 아마당이 보다 본모양 삼고요 지리 뒤돌랑이 큐도 양보래 소나 이 릴리드더니 등을 매받든지리 소나 삼나 대 사담지 바리스.
So even though Khenpo doesn't have a great familiarity with the partialities of Western people, he thinks that it might be, in addition to wishing their own mother and father are well and happy, and in addition to wishing the same for their own children, they also wish the same for their own dog.
다들 가서 스스로 강 다량자 배나 가서 아파 아마인 난자 나라서 보인 난자 되는 가서 키워다 릴리인 난자 대 정말 심신이 가서 강라 가나요 초콜릿.
Of course, all of these people, all of these subjects, whether they be our parents or our children or our pets, etc. Yes, of course, they're all living beings and they are all people and things we love and like.
강tar tini dindig nyarji de tini ta nga cho hajang ka chat chungchung 겹자 chungchung zre tini te pap garni te chat te pap garni semchen tamchu samji gore ma tong nge apa ama chigbo samna jigyo mare tini nge bodang bomo samna jigyo mare tini nge khodang tini to ta jimu tini samna jigyo mare semchen tamchu dungor dang meba tini zre na samna tini ta zo tela chamme ba tini zegres.
So even though we of course we like and love and feel great attachment to our parents and our children, our dogs, etc. This is a very restricted, a limited, a small kind of aspiration. And what we need to do is to make that aspiration bigger, much more vast, so that it extends to all living beings, in the hope, in the great wish that they be free from suffering.
Tanita nipa, tani nyanjiri, tani nipa de gangrezena shambaris. Shambazia de gangrezes, Simpson Tamshit, oya, tani deva damba, tataring also condu, dungur menas and nyanjiri. Tani sama demota, keboda, the also pena chuluguni janangazo, Nambayananda, Yeshichubayananda, tani Muslim Guchubayananda, tani also Hamid Navata, Usubayananda. Tani chik te pangpa toni murik pangpa nangpo chayina, servo chayina, karo chayina ja. Tani simchin tamsha te yongsu zoba te demo kebo tani resona samne tani ta koranga sem ka tani tani samna tani tela te shamba chamit tani zegres.
So the first of the four immeasurables was compassion. The second, loving kindness, is, well, the first, the wish or the aspiration of compassion is that all living beings be without suffering. And the aspiration behind loving kindness is that all living beings, regardless of their class or creed or skin color, etc., all living beings have happiness and the causes for happiness. This is the aspiration of loving kindness.
Tenite nibare tasamba gawa chamezati kandi rezenam perna namginina tini ngarancho dangacho de ngarancho ji nye sanja bonja bomoja pamanda tindisla demo ki boyona ngacho ga teni mo jambazala demo ki boyona ngacho ji gayang marga dugyang marga kapkapsa tarum mo jambala teni demo ki boyona ngacho semganala margaya tendi yongorezi namgin ngacho tendizre.
And then the third of the four immeasurables is joy, or is, yes. And what we're talking about here is,
ngacho namgin ina ngacho muziate kandizrezena pena ngacho rang soso rang te apa ama ina ta pubumo ina te tisola demo ki boyona ngacho ga. Tani jamba sola demo ki boyona ngacho jimurga ta tarung kapkapsa tani jamba la demo ki boyona ngacho semganala murgawa tendi yongoreze namgin ngacho muziate tindizrez.
Our general state of being is that we wish happiness and well-being for those who are close to us, and for those who aren't, have, well, indifference, or even in some cases a desire for them not to have happiness and well-being.
Tani ta panchuni tani zu mayimba tani ngacho ranga susuranga pama pogo yinanja te mayimbi mojamba yinanja musatang slayan tani demo tang kepo tani yona tele jande perna stanja zonja tani ngacho chochak shanja shinja tani zgina korangla demo kepo tani yona semkanala gamu yone o ta korangla yabu yongondo tani te korang tan tani muntani korang demo kepo yona tani samni semkanani tani sem So
what joy is the wish that all people, regardless of whether they're the ones close to us, our relatives and friends, or they're people that we don't know or don't like, it's the wish that all people, regardless of who they are, or all beings, including animals of all different shapes and sizes and everything else, that they be well, obtain happiness, do well. This fervent wish is what we refer to when we speak of the immeasurable of joy.
Teni te sambare ta jepati tangyum zegre teni tangyum zeyati penangaso teni gawa inna de shamba inna teni simchin tamche polan jamnyum gugoni simchin tamche teni ta dewa dang damba dang teni dungri inna ta simchin tamche dungur mepa samni teni par chamnyum gugoni shuri me pa goni tendi samna tendi tela tanyum zegres tanyum chame zegres.
And when we speak of the fourth immeasurable of equanimity, what we're talking about is the great wish that all people, with utterly no partiality whatsoever, all living beings, in fact, be well, be happy, be free from suffering. This is what we talk about with the fourth immeasurable.
다 지보데라 코스 소소라 되니 랑랑 되니 곰르 되니 또 용더실르 먼저와 지요레스.
And with these four immeasurables, we have four different kinds of meditational practice or method.
되니 티 지보디 나네 소 치슈데 하정 거 치슈디 강레제나 되니 냥진데레 냥진데 요소나 양바탄제 요용 거레.
And within these four methods, the most important of them all is that of compassion. If we can accomplish this practice, then all of the others will also ripen as a matter of course.
다 던지엔디 가서 대랑 가서 검lực 지보디 시작하면서 티나네 냥지 검lực 지보디 시작해서.
So today we're not going to talk about all four of the practices. We're going to focus on the practice of the meditation on compassion.
Dani 냥지 검서 티나네 dani 강레제나 당가서 검lực 냥지 검lực 멈보여레다. 이나 가서 dani 냥마나라 페나 린진 지메랑바 제안다다 dani 저 빠트름보체 제안다 콩소어 dani 냠린 냠뇽 So
within the different practices on compassion, the different meditations on compassion, of which there are many, tonight we're going to focus on the teachings within the lineage of Paltru Rinpoche.
코솔라 등물 간디 누 땡아서 하고야 돼 하정갈 심보레스.
So what's really important to start off with this is that we have an understanding of what other living beings, what the nature of their suffering is, how they suffer. It's very important that we have an understanding of this.
땡아서 망보 지금 랑그 등월때 하고 요래 마토바 랑그 등월때 공컨때 하정 뉴뉴레스.
A lot of people have a fairly clear idea of their own suffering, but don't have much understanding or insight into the suffering of others.
Perna shugbu yinna, teni koranga orwu chog dungmurte kantrigen, parchirga hako mare, hako na hako kante nyonyo matoyo mare.
For example, a rich person, a person with great wealth, probably has not much idea of the suffering of poor people, or those who do have an understanding of it are probably very few indeed.
Tani danga so shusoko tola yinna perna shusoko tola teni mo toptang yonken, wangcha yonken, tenjizi yinna, tani koranga shusoko tola toptang menken, wangcha menken ke mo tosoko dungmur kantrigen, te koranga parchir hago mare.
And similarly, those in society with position and power and influence probably have very little understanding of those in society who are powerless and without privilege and all kinds of prerogatives that those in power enjoy.
Teni ngason roa mir shitang la teni samlo tana ngaso mo namji dungmurte maotong ba ngaso stokshak dungro da teso dungmurte gandri ngaso hayang ko mare ngaso samlo yang tang mare.
And in terms of humans, in fact, we have very little understanding of the suffering of animals, what the nature of their suffering is. We don't understand it, and we don't think about it in many situations very often.
다른 가서 삼로 먹당 왔잠도 마츠 되니 가서 르비 종르크 토네 종망보 즈네 되니 쪽착데 솔라 코나 코솔라 등무리오 마레즈네 된디 샹컨 페르나 너쇼 콘사니르 바바 디카 과랑소 된디 양샤바 쇼어레즈 로지기 토라 된디 망보요레.
So not only do we not think about the suffering of animals, but humans have even written all kinds of treatises that deny the suffering of animals, including, for example, things that were written by the philosopher Descartes, etc.
Tani ngaso roa mo namji chokchak nam ge dungar hamoko, tani mo shigbo namji changbo oro namji dungar hamoko, Teni mo wangcha yung kan so wangcha mepa so teni dungmur de ha mago wa ti thone teni ngara chola jamnyim mayem batang teni dungmur mambo ti thone shongores.
And in fact, the source of great suffering is that the very fact that humans don't know or understand the suffering of animals, that those with all kinds of power and privileges don't understand the nature of the suffering of those people who don't, that the wealthy and very affluent don't understand the suffering of those who are in poverty.
That indeed also mo shibuzina oru namgi dungmur kandiyan korang mambo samlo tangate hajang garchin bore teni wangcha yongkan toptang yongkan tendizina teni shusoko tola wangcha memba toptang memba mnyamchong te so teni dungmur kangin te korang samlo tangate garchin bore ngason roa mirra inna teni ngaso mali nyamchongwa ga teni ramba chi mawa ga teni dungro ta te so dungmur kangin la samlo mambo tanga te garchin bore.
So what's really important is that those who are extremely wealthy and affluent really think about and investigate, come to understand the nature of those who are poor. Similarly, those who have great power and influence think about and come to understand the nature of the suffering of those who don't. And that human beings, we come to understand and have insight into the suffering of animals and all of those kinds of creatures that seem to exist below us.
Tamdu Denisha, Dotter Denisha, Nato Mo inanja, Chochagananja, Jamba Namgi Dumurla, Samlo Mambo, Tayate, Sava, not Chishu de.
So the really essence or the core of this practice is that humans or people in positions of relative ascendance really think about and attempt to understand the suffering of others.
Tanita ngaso perna simshin chochagen nanja, perna nyachgen nanja, sha in nanja. Tani jamba gatan rose in nanja, tenjiga, pena jamba nam gatini saya, tapena juperna shira, jag two that hangs, or tenjiga nala yonkan simshin in nanja, de parching out some mambos can tongo marita in now, takarte, penato sharshota wayna, azo teni dumchum, somanyosa gatini chonra, jag chang. Otinala teni simshin mambo teni saya teni yorisi teni nashokla yota menge hako me ganster teni simshin chig la teni ngaso onyuk tani teni samlo tango ores.
So what's important is that we obtain knowledge through our own personal experience, with our own eyes, our own personal experience, the knowledge of the suffering of other beings, whether it be a bird or a fish or those animals who are facing death in the slaughterhouse or in the different markets and things like that. Kempel's not sure about the situation in the West, but certainly in China this is the case. It's very important that people with their own eyes come to face this suffering and gain an understanding of it.
Teni ngaso namgin ngaso kandirezena teni shira nang nanja teni chomap chongsang nang la nanja teni shatang pagdang nyatang deso koso saya ga simshin deyna koso su jimba ga teni simshin desola ngaso sama ga tando ka marezi ngaso tando sa de gangrezena teni de karancho gangze chaoji shichang la gangze gre oya 超市了，地拿了有把个，等你下一那，他们要不要么要啥，等下就单独个的。
In fact, we don't often want to see these things. We don't want to see the suffering pigs or fish or birds in the markets. What we do want to see, and what we do see, is the cleanly packaged meat that we find in our supermarket freezer sections.
이나 가서 보고 되니 고치 총강제 그래超市 디나라 용큰 그디 샤데라 되니 콜라 담깃 망보다 콜라 로지 망보요 그래 대소 가서 상마가 따고 말이 삼고 말이
So when we encounter this cleanly and nicely packaged meat in the supermarket, we don't think much about the history, what the chain of events and circumstances that have gone into this fact of this piece of meat on that we're finding in the supermarket. We don't think much about the background, about its history. So not only do we not think about it, it doesn't come to us to think about it, we also don't want to think about it. What this is an avoidance of reality. From a Buddhist point of view, it's absolutely vital that we do think about this, that we don't avoid this reality. It's extremely vital that we see with our own eyes and don't avoid the most frightful suffering that animals, in fact, have to go through. So, for example, the knife that pierces the stomach of the fish, or the cutting off of the bird's head, or the various other kinds of horrible methods through which pigs, for example, are killed. It's not viable. It's not okay for us to turn away and say, oh, I don't want to watch this. I don't want to see it. I like eating my meat. No, it's important that we as Dharma practitioners really come face to face and confront this suffering.
Tani tandi simchin de jochang de tani korang ta langsang tani ta mojamba ga tani sakreze tani sanna korang ka sem ko thola njita tani lipo ko thola dungar ti halipa tani tani chembo ta yongre tena korang tani juna na trosa yo mare tani korang kan thamna na man namla tani thap thap ko mare tani korang inda manda tani dungar chembo tani nyong ne ta tan ro gore samne ta te sem ko nala sam gore.
And what we do need to think in this very moment is that this animal, that this creature, this living creature, is on the absolute cusp of being killed, and at this point must be feeling such intense terror and fright. They've got no way to escape. There's no other place that they can go to. There's no other fate for them. We really need to think about and understand, confront the terror, the sheer terror and fright of living creatures who are at this point. And at this point, when we're watching them, it's not as if we're watching a movie. It's not as if we're watching a play. We're a spectator on the side, a bystander. No. What we do need to think is, imagine if that living creature right now were me.
Ya yana garti nya de teni ngaranga apa inna ngaranga ama inna teni kanti do samne te samgores.
Or what if that living creature right now were my father or my mother?
Teni ngaranga apa inna ama inna ngarang rang inna teni nge muschila yang teni noban ki me muschila yang teni mamthamba lega na kang li yo marita yena teni mujamba ga teni zanshi ko ni zawang ko ni teni ta ngan teni shini teni sut 직계라 접습 딘디시나 다 강디연 사리 삼니 대삼고 그랬어.
다 양자 지소나 좋게 보라.
양치치샤나 간디레스나 되니 다 가르테 되니 다 나랑랑 있는자. 되니 나랑가 아파 있는자 아마 있는자. 되니 무잔라 노파치요 마레 무잔라 멍텀바글레카카 길레요 마레다 이나 잠바가 되니 코랑가 되니 저 왕식고니 되니 잠보고니 다 길라 야나 냥나라 딘디시나 당가 간디연 사리 등물 간디즈고 사리 삼니 대삼고 그랬어.
So really what we need to think about at this point is, regardless of whether it were me or my mother or father, whoever it was, what would I do? What would it be like at this point when a knife is about to be driven into my stomach or my head's about to be cut off? To really sympathize, empathize, to think very, very, to really attempt to understand in a very visceral way what the nature of this experience would be.
Yana Tanita, Nyayana, Shayana, Pagina, Di, Narango Puyina, Narango Pumuti Yina, Tandina, Narango Puda, Narango Pumuti, Muzala Nopa, Leka, Kakimale, Korang, Tendi Deo Capsa, the name Muzambazikati, Koranga Kila Tuzini, Nyanala Tuzini, Koba Kala Tini Tindishina, the Kandians are Samni, the Nindanga Goris.
Or think or contemplate, what would it be like if that animal, that fish or that bird or were my own son or my own daughter that was about to have its stomach cut or its heart pierced or its neck stabbed? What would I do? What would that be like?
Yana tani nyayana shayana the ngarang chutiyana ngarang tini jimu shila kodwa oya te yana tini ta ngarang chuti mozala no pa na shio mare ngarang tini ta shila de mozan sutila no pa masina mozan baz yone ngarang chu tini kichana tini nyana la trg jamna tini tindi shi sona kantiyan sare samne te rang salno tangores.
Or, my own son or daughter, as we've just said, or even still my own dog. What if it was my own dog and someone else was to come along and just to come along and to inflict great harm in one of these terrible ways on my own dog? What would that be like? What would that feel like? What would that kind of suffering be?
Nyayana, Shayana, Simjin Tisotini, Dumur Kosola, Gantiyote, that's a Hakoyungaris.
And by thinking like this and by contemplating like this, we will be able to generate an understanding of the kind of suffering that other living creatures, particularly animals, go through.
Tendiga Samlo Matana, Gantirizina, Teningazo, Nyayana, Shayana, Teni, Garton, Chumbum, Tendi, Mambozu Sakayona, Masu Mukantona, and Tengasu similar Toragayo Maris, Tendin Dama.
So without doing this, without going through this kind of contemplative process, then it will be impossible for us to generate this kind of feeling. We'll continue to eat countless meals of animal flesh, and we will not be confronting the reality of the suffering that these animals go through.
Ta tendi shapi kapsatini tendi sambi kapsatini yang teni ta ramba nipa de kang sam go rezena te ramba tambo de wa ta ramba nipa de kang sam go rezena teni ngarang go boyena pomoyena ngarang apa mayena ngarang cheyena gangena te khorang la samlo tambayena khorang go noba chindo ko rezena khorang demo ki boyon sona samne tin do kare ma to ba teni khorang dungriona ko demo ki bo mayona sam kan ko mo chigyo mare So
that was the first stage, and then the second stage is really to contemplate on the fact that there is absolutely no person who would wish that their own family members, parents, children, animals, etc., be inflicted with harm or suffering. There is absolutely no person who would think this way.
Then tatsuso dari pamayena Buddha bomoyena seinanja then koranso dungur me deva yona koranso undoko yore tani chama dungmur mena dokyo re tani ta korang chola dungmur chembo masat dungmur chung ina tani to korang chola mena samni to dungmur te mena ga samni tindi samgyo re dewa ina tani dewa chembo masat tani dewa chung ina te korang cho yona samni tindi samgyo re te nga chon roa mir tamchi ina ja chokshak tamchi ina ja tamchi jamnyim re te nga cho chama ga tani samgyo re.
And then similarly, all living creatures, without exception, desire freedom from suffering, alleviation from suffering, not even great suffering, even the smallest suffering. Nobody wants it. And in terms of happiness, not just great happiness and bliss, but also even small kinds of happiness. These are things that all living beings really long for.
Teni koranga teni deva yungnasam, dungmur menasam, teni samgayoreta, yena teni mujamba namki teni korang zambo gone teni ta zungne, teni korang la zambo gone teni ta simchen ko chokjat, korang ko lig tola, sem ko tola, dungmur mambo teni to parhtani, ta dungmur mambo yungchigni, ta teni shigayore ma tokba, korang ko chikyang do kumare samni ti samgogres.
So what we need to think is that despite the fact that all living beings have absolutely no desire for suffering and every wish for happiness, that still there are people who come along and inflict them with great harm and suffering. And what we really need to really develop the understanding of in our minds is that there is absolutely no living creature who would want badness or suffering from themselves or their loved ones, and no living creature who would not similarly not want happiness for themselves or their loved ones.
Oya ta tinti yendi nga cho perna sha ta phaksha ge tani nga cho njiktum je gre ya kwantho oya te yen nan ja tani nga cho tani sha ge nga cho ya wo ge shapchi je gre ya ge jijing zama ga na la lu ya oya Tiso tsama tini korang ka thum ka tokla gati tiyo re zona tini shada, phagda, yabu zhini taga ta korang ka mun namla tini korang ka zhingayan tini korang ka mun namla tini shijin joko yan zini tini ka tini rimo yakbu mambu tiyo ti tsama ngukor ya rezi, chikyang ka ndoko yo ma rezi korang mun namji nga sanni ngi mun namla shijin joko yan samkang ka tini shayo ma re tini ka phagayo ma re, chikyang yo ma rezi.
So when we look at the labels on canned food or on the small labels on packets of all kinds of MSG kinds of foods, flavorings and seasonings, and see that they contain animal ingredients, no, it's not this case that the animals whose parts who can constitute these foodstuffs have willingly have donated their lives for the sake of these foods. It's absolutely not that case at all. All of these animals have arrived in these food forms quite unwillingly.
Tani tindishini samlo mambo tangna tani tazo ngaso jambacho tini semjen namla tani dungar mambo yoyate ngaso hakoyong gres.
So thinking like this and really working on this kind of contemplation, we will come to the understanding of the nature of the suffering of other creatures and living beings.
Tani ngacho tenro sikposiki yo mare mo nangla yenna pena ngacho ngarancho lipo detang yembi kapse tani nati nana tini ti dungur te chintising hako mares then ngarancho soso tini lila napshon wi kapse mankan ganalan jo wi kapse tini tazo nati dungur zeate haleba dungur chimbo yembate tazo ngacho sigres.
So it's not just about coming to understand the suffering of animals, but also about human suffering, the nature of human suffering. In fact, when one has an illness or a sickness oneself, one understands the nature of that. But when they go to the hospital and see the scale of illness and sickness around them, then it's possible to gain an insight into the suffering of illness of others.
Teni ngacho tenro namla tenti samlo tang charwi jisu teni ngacho mo nangla yana teni mo orbo mo napa teni mo teni kalak teni taga te wangbo ma changyanda da teni taga mo nani nyamchung 다때서 mambo teni yoba teso dunguri yoba ga mambo yoba teso tamchil la samlo tane ta karti nga dendrizina gandiyan sares teni mund ngaranga apayena gandiyin ngaranga bodang bomo yena gandiyo sares samne teni nga so mug na la yan teni samlo jib ko tang ko gres.
So after we've done the contemplation on animals and other creatures, we need to turn our minds to humans of all kinds of different predicaments and situations, those without power, those without money, those in poverty, those in all kinds of difficult and compromising situations. We need to really think, what would it be like if these people or that person were me? What would that be like? What would it be like if that person over there or that person in that situation were my own father or were my own mother? That's what we need to really work on contemplating next.
Tendi go ni samlo matangna nga so masega na ne teni so nyamnyung chorwa dewa yenna chorwa dungor yenna tendi mambo zo teni nga so par song sarviji se teni nga so langsang jindo yore te samlo matang teni mo jamba namla pe na mo jamba la nat yona zai ke mepa gonje mepa teni janchik teni mambo na la mambo la teni dungor mambo chor tendi shena teni nga so samala ta na la teni jamda mambo nga so zambalang neser mambo nyima riri la ha so ko yore ta yina ta nga so o tendi re so mambo shesong samji tendi zama to ba ji yo maris.
It's really difficult for us to really take on board and keep in mind the suffering and the really difficult situations that are endured by other people, whether that be people who are sick, people without clothes, people without food, people without rights and privileges, freedoms, etc. Every day, of course, we're confronted with a great influx of information of people in difficult situations in the news, etc. But it goes one in one ear and out the other, and it's not something that we really take on.
Bernanga ni tong jiji lola namzhe na ne tani lhombi mate so zambalang ka sharnab tamje bo domna parche ni tong chachje da lak tani resongs.
Probably, for example, in the year of 2014, the fatalities from airplanes that descended into the ocean totaled more than 1,000 people.
Teni nga so samlo matangna gandiz rezina o sanjir ka tola tena namzhe chi lhone mo nivja she sonze nivja da ngapchi she sonze sanje namzhe chi lhone nivja da dunchi she sonze o nga so o ni mangbo she sonza samge teni ma to chorwayo mare.
So we see in the news, today an airplane went down and 250 people died. A few days later another one goes down and 170 people died. And we think, so many airplanes going down and so many people dying. Beyond this, we don't think much further.
Teni ti kapsa ngasu teni samlo tane karti ngarang rang ti namzhe ti nangla yona ngarang ti ni mo nivja da ngapche ga ni mchig yinna tani kanti yo sare samne samlo tana.
So really, when we are confronted with these kinds of news, what we do need to think is, what if I were among those 250 people who went down in that airplane disaster? What if I were one of those people? What would I have felt like? What would it have been like for me?
That tendishine ngaso te tabnama naso ko gonin joa mirki dumur cheboyena chongchongyena. So la samlo tane teni samlo tang zapu teni tang teni shi yondi teni nga so machama teni dingoriena chokchak so dingoriena ha chang tang zapu teni shik chabu teni kegres ha go yongres.
So by really dedicating ourselves to thinking about and putting ourselves in the position of others in suffering, whether it be animals or humans, and generating a really intense and visceral sense of what their suffering is like, then this is the method that we need to adopt in order to come to an understanding of the suffering of others.
Teni nga so mo yena chokchak yena koso go dungor te teni tang zapo ko alo ni nga so ha ko yong kapsu teni kandi zerezena mo sda se na nga so mo sem ko tang de la teni korang so tamje bo mo sem de teni samba zambu je yingereze ya ze na shanliang oya teni rezi te yindi teni chama go ta mambo teni mo semjin nam ko dungmor mambo nyong ko ta yak bore son te driksong samri teni samkan yo mareze chama o semjin namla dungmor mambo teni mambo zendo ta dungmor te mena samni teni samyong grese mo chama rangjin gi teni samyong grese.
So by really coming to a really deep understanding of the suffering of others, we need to view all of these people as good people. We should certainly not have some kind of idea that either these people's suffering is deserved or that they should suffer or anything like that. No, what we really need to do is cast a fervent wish that all people be free from this kind of suffering.
대 김선 가래리잖아. 나초 뭐 탐식 것도 샘거 나라 냥지 것더니 냥지 총총서 나초 뭐 참아라 요래지. 옛날 때니 티 냥지 때다 나초 뭐 망보 등거다 텐디도 마시나 때니 코랑 총총시 내가초 샘거 나라 때니 누구를 야 침보래 듣고 말이지. 샘전 참아 등거다 마시나.
Because without knowing the suffering of others and without identifying and empathizing with it, then even though everybody does possess the seed of compassion in their own hearts, without going through this practice of really, growing it and ripening it, then it's not possible for it to grow larger and grow bigger. And accordingly, it's not possible to really come to an understanding of the suffering of others.
Tani ti kapsa nga so tini mo ina chokchak so dungmer ta hale pa tang za mo tini ha ko yong wi kapsa tini nga so mo sudang si ke na sem ka na la ta dungmer te so me so na dungmer te me pa re so na samba dang tini chama demo re so na ki bo re so na sam gi ti samba da tini nga so semchen tam cha ha jang dungmer yem ba ti si song ti tini ko shik che re ro re.
And by our increasing understanding of the suffering of others and empathy with the understanding of others, then our wish for them to be free of suffering and our wish for them to enjoy happiness and obtain happiness will grow bigger and bigger and bigger.
Benanga choteni zambalong ko sacha khashi latini sayum gyabanrada zambalong ko sacha khashi latini ju nam mamba thamba gyabni tini zaji kunji me panrada teni mambo teni yungu yore te ngacho sanjir ko nawa nala mambo ko yore ta daily kyang ngacho teni ngune ngacho sacha tela soni tana teni ngacho chorwa jamba yo kres chorwa ha chang shitrak poteni yo kres yungres.
And so what will happen is that when we hear news of people suffering in earthquakes, etc., or through, food safety disasters, etc., that we won't view them as others, people remote from ourselves, that our feeling of compassion for them will really grow in its intensity and strength.
이 김선 가래리제 나가서 사르쇼 고토네 냐나 산지르 고토네 나와가 나라냐나 아주 집모tin디 집차 야보자 하고 땅자모 하고 말에 내가 알아서 사샤텔라 손이 먹듯이 따나 다 하정 땅자모 하정 서루즈고 그래 대고위 김선기 내가 아주 그때 셈라양 되니 초로와대양 문자위 김선데 딘디즈레스.
And it's through really seeing with our own eyes, seeing live in front of us the suffering of others, not just merely hearing about it or knowing about it at a distance. It's that direct encounter with the suffering from others that will generate a quality of feeling that is quite different to simply second-hand knowledge of suffering of other beings.
다티 갑상아서 오더니 샘전 사마 오더니 등거르 때니 땅잠 못더니 시용디 되니 가서 그 샘거 나라 되니 저 샘거 땅네 되니 소소 랑그 샘거 땅네 다 샘전 대소 담주 부 등거르 파 메바레소나 삼네 되니 카시 니메 그 되니 삼용 거래 데라 되니 다 냥지제 그랬어 냥지 참메제 그랬어 샘전 담절라 삼나 되니 다 데라 냥지 참메제 그랬어.
So as a result of knowing and confronting and coming to understand the suffering of others, the really intense desire and wish that all of these beings be utterly free from suffering and instead enjoy every happiness, the really strong generation of this wish is what we're referring to by the fourth immeasurable of compassion.
Teni ti ramba ni patiri, ta ramba samba ti kangrezina, teni ti kapsi teni to tarung teni chorwa ti yar shitak bore yona, teni kansam karezina, teni ta semchin do chor tamche pola dungur mena samni ngarang ka sem ko samba chamgi yong mandu. O ta nge teni semchin do chor dungur ti par mebashi odomodo nge teni ta go ndu samgi ti sem ti poba de yong karez. Te ramba samba ti poba ti ke yong karez.
So that was the second stage. And then the third stage is with this really fervent understanding of the suffering of other beings, what we need to do then is to really generate the confidence and generate the conviction that I will assist or I will alleviate the suffering of other beings.
Tati kapsa nge semchin do so dungur te mebache gona Gandhi na tabshi kandas gone teni dungur mebache go samne samlo tangdi teni o ta sargi sona ngarang sargi shakya ta bandawo teni re sona teni nge semje mambola teni pantona yakbo to sare teni nge yindam ta ngarang njok nyer ke teni ngarang sargi go samne teni samyong gore te teni ta ramba samba teni ta nyarji te shangship ko sim teni re songores.
So then this third stage is that when really generating that conviction and wish to personally benefit all living beings, we need to think about how we're actually going to do that. And we need to cast the sincere aspiration that we will achieve Buddhahood in order that we can benefit beings in this way. And when we have cast this really fervent aspiration in the third stage of this practice, then this fourth immeasurable of compassion has become bodhicitta.
Ya tatini shanship ko sem gumsar zenanda jongder shitav zenanda tetindizri.
And this is a practice of the generation of bodhicitta.
Teni ngato terang dina yongken ko tsangma teni ti ton la samlo yak botang teni ti gum gyawya te ngato tsangma la rewa yins.
So I have great hope this evening that everybody who's come can really think about these things and really put them into practice through their own meditation.
Teni ngato namgin gandhi rezena teni ngato perna bobandra yinna teni ngato chumchangchik botela ngato la 저 샤와 람주요야 되니 겸상치 보텔라 되니 저 나지 차지 메야 되니 그돈데 되니 가서 라마다 잡아서 가서 겸랑라 용내 되니 지금 논견자 되니 mambo 되니 시기 되니 그 릭토리오레스.
So among us Tibetans, sometimes we've got a tradition of, for the sake of our own family's happiness or for the sake of our own family's prosperity and good fortune, etc., inviting lamas and monks to come to our homes and recite scriptures and prayers.
Tani jamunrao inna tini to namjin tini to sosochi tini shawalamjo yoyata 총람조요야 더니 소소 더니 저다 나지 사지 메가 딘지 돈달라 더니 소소 곰방나란조네 더니 초반버야다 더니 뿌퍼네 더니 상기라 저런 거 나라 더니 샤왈람조요야 딘지 지쇼다 더니 네 교라더니 뿌버거연 지중버거연 지셰거연네 더니 파랍그레스.
And as for Chinese, similarly, they, for the sake of their financial prosperity or the smooth runnings of their own family, good luck in life, etc., have the custom of going to the temple, offering incense before the Buddha and making a prayer, "Oh, Buddha, help me, give me all these things that I want." And as for what the Westerners do, he's not quite sure. Oh yes, but in terms of the things that the Tibetans and Chinese do, there's absolutely no meaning in any of it.
ngaso gyayen nanda boyen nanda nashok bayen nanda sama jantun la samlo tang jampan la samlo tang na teni ngaro so rang ton ti 디 시글안 적용 그래.
So really of what is of greatest essence, what is of greatest importance, regardless of whether we are Tibetan or Chinese or Westerner, is that we think about others, the benefit of others, their happiness and well-being, and not about our own selves.
Tani ngaso gyayena tenti chegendu tani jablama so tani ngaso bobaga tenti chegre tani ta soba mambon so tani chi tarji po mambo le tani ti nangla yone perna ngaso marme chimchona tani chi yenze pantok chi yo mo tela gormo chi goze tenti mambo le ne ngaso chongle ge tondala tenti lenken yang mambo yores.
So Chinese and Tibetans are both alike in going through all kinds of religious practices, almost kind of like kind of doing a religious kind of business transaction in order to obtain benefits for themselves. This is of even less meaning. This is not Buddhism. It's not. It cannot be classified as Buddhism. What is Buddhism is having great belief in the law of cause and effect. So within religion there is of course the saying, and there are people who say that it's not the Buddha who's going to help us, it's us who needs to help ourselves. And so what they mean by this is by saying that praying to the Buddha has no purpose at all. Oh, and what the meaning of this is that the Buddha's teachings, the Buddha has given us teachings about how to live and how to alleviate suffering. And what our task is to do for ourselves is to apply these teachings, to follow them and do them ourselves. And beyond this, the Buddha can't do anything to help us. It's really up to ourselves to put his teachings into practice. So what the Buddhist faith is and what the Buddhist teaching really is, the core of it is that we have proper belief in the law of cause and effect. That's the first thing. And the second thing, in benefiting others, in compassion. So tonight we've given a teaching on the practice of bodhicitta, which is a very convenient meditation that everybody can apply and everybody can really work on. In addition to this, there are in the Tibetan tradition, in Tibetan language, lots and lots of practices that people can that can also be studied and that can also be practiced. They are available in Chinese. There's lots available in Chinese language and also presumably in English as well. So that brings to conclusion our teaching tonight on bodhicitta and the four immeasurables. thank you to everybody.
Oya teni ta changmala jatti laglenga teni longre teni ta nga chom jingthar changma teni ngwa molum su she teni tera nga cho teni chuch jipi teni gewi chawan de la teni simchen thamche po nerkbs teni changmala teni cherangwa tang na me pa tang teni demo ke bo teni yong teni thartik simchen thamche sargi gombang thoya teni rena samjeta ta ti tenja zu yongyu shirte teni nge gewan de simchen thamche la par jingin samne teni sam gore tela ngwa zegre na teni nga chu teni gune ngwa shi gore.
So having concluded the transmission, now we will dedicate the merit from tonight's teaching, so that in the short term, all living beings may obtain happiness in terms of their immediate lives, be free from illness, be free from immediate obstacles, and that in an ultimate sense that they be free from suffering and obtain Buddhahood. That now we will dedicate our merit in prayer.
Sonam de tamja zubanya domne ni be dana banje ja je ga na je walon driba tribim zolin doa dorwa sho oma hom banzereng ger ba ma sa de hom oma hom banzereng ger ba ma Sada Hong Om Aho Banjarangara Bama Sada